Hey everybody, welcome to our webinar on Virginia cannabis legalization. We'll give everyone a few minutes here and then we'll get started pretty quickly. The intro stuff is less interesting, so it's okay if people miss it, but I'll give everyone a second just to filter in. And yeah, so everyone knows, we're gonna send around the slides. The recording will also be available on YouTube. Please feel free to like and share it and smash that subscribe button to our YouTube channel. Um, and yeah, so you'll get this, and we'll also send some other notes around. And then I'll say this at the end as well, but be sure you sign up to our newsletter, either on our website or you could just email us and we'll get you added. So you get our updates on Virginia because there's going to be a bunch of um, updates coming, over the next year here. So like obviously this information will be supplemented as we learn more about Virginia. Um, and let's see here. All right. So I'll say hi to Elliot here in a second. I got distracted by the chat. But all right, so let's get going. So adult use cannabis legalization in Virginia. It does say retail sales licensing, but I should have just called it licensing and new market opportunities because there's a bunch of different licenses. All right, so let's get rolling here. My auto is repeating itself. Is that true, everyone? Am I echoing? All right. Well, if let me know if it continues to echo. Okay. Seems like I'm good. All right. I'm going to stop looking at the webinar chat because it's making it hard for me to talk here. Um, all right. So yeah, this is just about we're just bragging about our law firm here. We're the greatest law firm in the history of the world. Bunch of offices, and we do a full range of legal services, litigation, regulatory compliance, corporate, transactional. I run the corporate group, and pretty much any legal work needed to be done by a privately held company. We don't really do public M&A necessarily, but we handle for company, and we're across the country. I'm based in Bethesda, Maryland, and Barden, Virginia, so I'm sort of the local guy for Virginia, but we have a whole team. Obviously everything's a little bit virtual now. These are speakers. Meg, Jerrico, why don't you introduce yourselves and I'll say a bit about myself.
Sure. Thanks, Charlie. My name is Meg Nash. I'm a partner in our Boston office. I've been very fortunate to work with Virginia applications in the past and interested applicants and companies. Really looking forward to the upcoming licensing round. And so thrilled that we finally got here. We'll talk a little bit about the winding path of getting here, but happy to have you all here and available to answer questions both today and in the future.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jerrico Perez. I'm in our Denver office and also had the pleasure of working on the initial Virginia applications and handle limited licensing applications and new market entry for our clients across the US. So, yeah, thrilled to be here to finally get to talk about the commercial regulation of adult use in Virginia. It's been a long road. If you were at our happy hour, we were very optimistic this was going to happen, but we certainly weren't sure. Saw some lows, but here we are. So excited to talk to you all about it, and hopefully we'll have another happy hour. You can join us in the future. I'll turn it over to Charlie to get us started.
Yeah, and just on that note, so we're going to be at the Lucky Leaf end of August in Richmond. If you want to stop by the table, say hi. I'll be there. I'm not sure who else is coming. Like I said, I'm in Bethesda, so it's just it's an easy 2 hour drive for me. And then yeah, we're gonna probably do another happy hour October 8th. So please sign up for the newsletter so we can tell you about our happy hour October 8th. I think in Richmond is the game plan. Um, yeah, I'm Charlie Alovisetti. Like I said, I run the corporate group. Next slide. This is I'm contractually obligated to hawk my cannabis book on every webinar I do. So here I am. It's a little out of date because of all the craziness that happened, but I still think it has some value in terms of just understanding sort of the basics of cannabis law. So certainly if you're new to the industry or you want to give it to your in-laws so they can have a little bit of a background, check it out. Second edition is in the works. Um, but we got to wait for the law to settle a little bit before we can finish it. Slide. All right, Meg.
All right. So getting back to our kind of winding road of how we got here, I wanted to briefly kind of give an overview of kind of the where we're coming from, where we're going, to kind of provide a framework on current market conditions. The medical program was established in 2017, for very limited uses, and then we had additional qualifying conditions added in 2018. The initial licensing process included, I believe it was 5 vertical licenses in specific areas to ensure sort of even distribution throughout the state. That has continued to kind of flourish in the background while, in 2021, we got an adult use bill. That was sort of a huge landmark moment, but unfortunately did not kind of tip the scales in terms of getting regulations and a commercial market at that time. What we did, however, get in 2024 was a dedicated regulatory body. Previously, the Board of Pharmacy was in charge of regulating pharmaceutical processors, which is the name for medical licensees in Virginia. But the Cannabis Control Authority was established in 2024. They've been overseeing the medical program and are overseeing the adult use program, and will also be overseeing the hemp program, which will get transferred to them as of August of this year. And for those following along at home, and as Jerrico mentioned, kind of at our initial happy hour, there's been a lot of movement here. We got a bill that was passed by the House and the Senate. It was vetoed, sent back with amendments. That didn't happen. But we'll kind of dig into the details of HB 30 shortly, but just sort of by way of orientation, that's where things stand today. Can you do the next slide, please? So as a result of those initial medical rounds, as well as one that was released in 2023, there are, currently 6 licensed or I'm sorry, this slide sets forth the number of licensed dispensaries in each region. You'll notice that there's not one currently operational in Northwestern Virginia. That was the license that was most recently awarded and is known as Health Service Area 1. But there is a designated licensee for that area. So we anticipate that they will be online soon. And if we could just flip to the next slide on some of the kind of consumer statistics. As you can tell from the prior side, this is not really an overly saturated market. For such a large state, more than 6.5 million residents, more than 1 million adult use consumers, sort of having 20 or so licensed medical dispensaries is certainly not, enough to kind of meet the demand that exists there. I think this is particularly true given that Virginia borders 4 states without adult use and is really the first, southern state that has legalized. So, kind of drawing back on what we saw from the very early days in Colorado, there's frequently a lot of kind of tourism, driving demand. So we anticipate that, this will be a market that's very attractive for people looking to enter the cannabis industry or existing operators, based not only on the current number of licensees there, but also on the potential consumers. Next slide, please. Okay. So digging in a bit more to HB 30 here, we provided some of the summaries of the initial bill, but now that we have the final law, thank goodness, we'll just kind of dig into the meat there. The updated date for retail sales to begin is July 1, 2027. We also anticipate that applications will open in February 2027 and that there will be regulations by February 2027. I will note that just this Monday, the Cannabis Control Authority released a survey on its website that's going to be open through July 21st that's asking for any input on future cannabis regulations. This is not the sort of formal rulemaking process, but is something that's available and is an opportunity to sort of have your input considered. So I'd encourage everybody to check that out. I also want to flag that for the retail sales beginning July 1, 2027, that is likely going to be limited to the dual use, existing medical licensees. We expect that there will begin to be a rollout of license awards, maybe May of 2027, but then there will be substantial lead time to kind of get up and running. So just flagging that kind of retail date in the context of the existing market. Um, some of the other kind of sticking points here to get to the final legislation or the 250 civil fine for public consumption that will go into effect in July. That did kind of land where the governor was hoping. But there were sort of balancing measures with respect to the equity reinvestment fund being retained in the final law. Next slide, please. The way that this law came into existence was through the budget. And we were fortunate that, this was a year while the biennium budget had to be approved, in particular with the governor, just recently coming in, this will very much be, a priority to get this done. So it's not the way we thought it would come into law, but at the end of the day, we have legislation. So that's a huge win. As I kind of mentioned, this timeline is important to keep in consideration. Thinking about, February 2027 for applications starting to be accepted, May 2027 for license awards, which will essentially be kind of a conditional license, where you'll then have 18 months to get operational. It's not like once you get the license in hand, you can start, possessing, distributing cannabis. But, they're definitely moving in a quick timeline. The fact that the CCA is already sort of soliciting input is a huge win to show that they're going to be proactive here. So hopefully that momentum continues and we'll start to get more information over the summer and certainly into the fall. Next slide, please. One of the things that stayed from the prior legislation is the different license types that will be available. The sort of, what you would expect to see: cultivation, processing, retail, a micro business, which is essentially a little vertical, transporter, delivery operator, a testing facility, and then the dual use marijuana facilities will be the existing pharmaceutical processors who will be able to convert to adult use. I will note that there is a hefty conversion fee of, I believe, $10 million for all the pharmaceutical processors. They can pay that over time if agreed to by the CCA. But if they are unable to pay or unable to convert to adult use, then their license cannot be renewed. So, we fully anticipate that every existing licensee will make that work, but it's not, it's not a small conversion fee. Next slide, please. So I'm going to kind of go over this quickly, just with respect to I think we hit some of this, the conversion fee, the 8% retail tax for marijuana, which will go into effect in 2029, as well as additional tax rates on top of that. So we're very fortunate to have an economist on staff who can kind of take that information and crunch those numbers to see how that may impact consumer demand, particularly as compared to other nearby markets. But yeah, another component to kind of think as you're strategizing for the future. Next slide, please. Fortunately, one of the things that remained in the final version of the bill is the prioritization of impact licensees. So if we can just go to the next slide. Thank you. To qualify for an impact license, an applicant must have at least 51% of ownership and direct control by a person or person who passes the bill's two-pronged eligibility evaluation. So the first is that individuals must show that they've resided in either a disproportionately impacted area between the years of 1999 and 2025, or a historically economically disadvantaged community for at least 3 of the past 5 years. Typically, the regulatory body here, the CCA, will release specific information with respect to what areas will qualify. Sorry, one second here. We don't have that information yet, but again, our colleague Andrew Livingston has been able to kind of do some data research if people are interested in kind of evaluating those initial prongs to determine if they may qualify. In addition to that checkpoint, individuals are also going to have to show that they've either been convicted or adjudicated delinquent for any violation of prior marijuana offenses, either that or that they're a kind of impacted family member, that a spouse or sibling was arrested or convicted for violation of prior marijuana laws, have lived for at least 5 years of public elementary or secondary school in a historically economically disadvantaged community, have received a federal Pell Grant. This criteria is very similar to the criteria that was rolled out in Maryland, which was kind of the first time that we had seen this Pell Grant qualification. So to the extent that anyone has experience with that from the Maryland licensing route, it may kind of come to bear here. Another qualifying criteria is if you're a veteran of the armed forces of the U.S., or if you've qualified for financial assistance relief from the Department of Agriculture as a distressed farmer. So we are waiting for additional information. Typically, what kind of kicks these things off is that the CEA will issue sort of a request for proposal from various vendors who may be able to administer the impact licensee evaluation. Not aware of that having happened yet, but we're monitoring everything very closely here. So again, as we know more, it will be in our newsletters, and we will certainly be updating everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, Meg. So the exciting part, or what I think is the exciting part, maybe it's corporate for you, but we'll talk a little bit about the application process and what we expect that may look like. If you've looked at the law or you've looked at the governor's version of the previous bill, we don't have a ton of information, a ton of detail in the budget bill about what exactly the details of the application are going to look like, but we have a good idea generally of the type of application process we're looking at here. In good news, if you're looking at the scales of application type, this is going to be a lottery. This is not going to be a merit-based application process like the previous medical licensee application process in Virginia. It's going to be purely lottery-based. So that's good news. When we know it's going to be lottery, that's in the law. But one thing we don't know is exactly how many of each license type they are planning to give. For sure, in the law, they are limited to giving only 350 retail licenses. Obviously, those license types will go to lottery. They're also limited to only giving 5 Tier 5 licenses, at least right now. Those are the highest canopy limit cultivation licenses, aside from pharmaceutical processors or the dual use, who I believe have up to 70,000 square feet of canopy. Tier 5 cultivation licensees will also be limited by lottery. The board does have the ability to limit the number of other license types. They have to publish an analysis of that by November of this year. So hopefully we'll know come fall whether or not we're looking at a limited number of all of the other license types, and we certainly could be. Micro businesses, we know, will also be limited. And that goes back to a bit of that timeline that Meg was just discussing. So by May, they're required to give 100 micro business licenses, and that's to impact licensees and to qualified hemp processors, growers, and farmers. They're also required to issue up to 10 cultivation licenses. Those and 10 processing licenses, also limited to the industrial growers or processors. I do want to point out for those 10 cultivation and 10 processing licenses that are being issued to the hemp qualified applicants, there is a $500,000 conversion fee if you're one of those hemp operators. That does not apply to those 100 micro businesses that are going to be issued to impact licensees and to the hemp processors and cultivators or farmers. I think that's an important point there. Meg might have addressed this, so forgive me if I'm being repetitive here, but one thing about these micro businesses is they are vertically integrated, right? You can conduct cultivation, you can conduct manufacturing, and you can conduct dispensing. And you can have up to 2 locations to do all of those things at. And they have to be located within 20 miles of each other. One important point, unlike some states with micro business license types, like Missouri, for example, micro businesses can do business with any other adult use license type. So you're not limited to just doing business with other micro businesses. So we do know that micro businesses will be giving that preference for the first lottery round, and that will be with a preference for impact licensees and the hemp groups. In addition to that, scoring, right? Not competitive here. We expect it will be pass-fail, so you meet the requirements and you're entered into the lottery. What we don't have a lot of detail on is what those requirements are going to look like. You can go to the next slide, Kia. One thing we do know, and that's an important part of this when we're talking about application readiness in any state, is that, as noted here, while real estate is very important, it's not required at the initial point of application submission. So when we're talking about financing and capitalization, which Charlie's going to get into here in a bit, one of the biggest costs, right, in application preparation is real estate. That's explicit in the law that it will not be required at initial application. You have that 18-month timeline if you're selected in the lottery to submit your property, show that it complies with all of the local ordinances. As Meg said, localities can't ban marijuana businesses, but there are setback requirements that are important. So while real estate isn't required to submit your initial application, it's going to be important because we're talking about a limited number of businesses, right? Especially on the retail level, 350. There's requirements in the law that they be geographically spread out. And then once you're selected in the lottery, the board will go to the locality and ask for input. And while they can't ban, a locality can't ban, they can provide input saying that, you know, we've already got 50 retail stores in this area. We don't want any more. And that's explicit in the law as a criteria that the board can entertain to decide whether or not they're going to issue your final license. Assume they would let you change your location. But again, based on your business plans, right, for the state long term, real estate's going to be a hot commodity. And those groups that are well funded and well prepared have particular locations and areas they want to locate in. So if that's something that you want to locate in Richmond, it's smart to start looking at real estate right now. It is going to be limited, especially with the setbacks. The setbacks for properties are 1,000 feet from things like hospitals, schools, daycares. Localities can reduce those if they want to, but they are fairly significant, especially as far as how broad types of facilities are. Charlie?
Yeah, Jerrico, I just want to jump in and I guess I kind of ask a question, right? So as far as I understand it, right, none of these localities in Virginia really have addressed cannabis yet. Simply because, yeah, this, a few of them started thinking about, but I mean, so if I'm a licensee, right, what should I be doing with respect to localities? Should I be talking to localities, engaging with them to try and proactively lobby? Should I be tracking all these different localities to think what's gonna and then what should I be thinking in terms of zoning, and how the localities, how far can they go up to that line, right, where it starts to get into this zoning that effectively becomes, a local opt-out?
Sure. So absolutely. I will say that, we have clients that have been interested in the Virginia adult use market for years, and we've been tracking already localities who are starting to draft ordinances, starting to talk about these things. Adult use zoning is on the agenda right now in some localities. So yes, if you know where you want to locate or there's areas you think you might want to locate, you should absolutely start attending those meetings, start talking to the council, start talking to leadership in whatever locality that may be. If you can show them that you're a reputable operator, you're a model operator. A lot of these people don't know anything about cannabis. So showing them that, retail cannabis can actually improve property value rates, right? There's a lot of misinformation about cannabis establishments. So starting to address that now, starting to show them that you're the business they want in their community is important. Because they can start zoning to just the downtown corridor, right? While they can't ban, they can explicitly determine time, place, manner, hours of operation, and zoning. We saw this in Minnesota, where it's a similar thing going on there. And some localities will take it as far as they can, assuming that nobody's going to sue them if they do effectively ban all but one location, right? 2 locations. Yeah, so looking at property right now, especially on the retail side, is going to be very important, even though it's not required at application submission. Charlie, you can talk a little bit more about that when you talk about corporate structure and financing. Corporate structure is very important here because while vertical integration is allowed in Virginia and you can apply for multiple different license types, you can't have an interest in more than 5 licenses. And interest, Charlie, again, is going to talk more about this, but that's defined as 10% of pretty much any type of interest. So you can't be a 10% or more owner on more than one application is what you can assume those restrictions are going to look like. So what is your corporate structure going to look like? What lotteries are you going to enter? Are you going to apply for just a micro business impact licensee? That's important because if you hold a micro business, you can't hold any other license type. You can only hold that one micro business. So that's very limited, but otherwise you can hold 5 of any other license type.
And Jerrico, one other thing I wanted to get your view on here is with this micro license, and I got kind of my own take, which I'm curious if you agree on here, but like with a micro license, could I apply for a micro license and then only use the retail section of that license, right? Just wholesale everything else so that it becomes essentially like a backdoor. I don't know if backdoor is the right word, but it essentially just becomes a retail license.
I'm not sure if that's actually explicit in the law. Meg, correct me if I'm wrong and that's a great question, Charlie. In some states, you do have to, and in others, you may only have to do one.
Yeah, because I think in Michigan, if I remember correctly, at one point it was like you had to produce and grow everything that you sold in your store, which was totally untenable for people. And then they relaxed it and allowed people to buy, products so, the stores could actually sell brands people had heard of. Because I was gonna say my view is it seems like it's not really clear in the statute, and this is something we'd have to look for in the rules, and the board could decide it. I mean, I hope they're flexible because it'll allow, these impact licensees to potentially build a business. But I wanted everyone watching the webinar to put that in their mind in terms of like, why would you want a micro license? Well, it's a different bucket of licenses, right, to apply for. Um, you're not in the general bucket, so maybe you have a better chance of success, but it could still potentially be a retail license, which would have, real value in a state where you're thinking there's what, max 450 retail locations.
Mm-hmm. Meg.
350. Yeah, I just was going
Well,
to
sorry,
say that.
I was counting the micros as,
Oh, I see.
you
Gotcha,
see what I mean?
gotcha.
Because I feel like I feel like the real value of the micro license for a lot of people is going to be in that retail portion, I guess is my thought. Just curious.
Yeah, it's not in statute, and I do believe it'll, kind of become available by rule, if not kind of application, materials, FAQs.
Mm-hmm.
I will say that from the outset, our initial analysis was that kind of the drafting, at least the initial version of the bill, was very similar to Minnesota. And in Minnesota, you are allowed to kind of piecemeal operate. Like you have to get one prong of your micro open within 18 months, but you don't have to do all 3 within the first 18 months or ever. So to the extent that the CCA is kind of communicating with OCM in Minnesota, which it seems as though there's been some dialogue there. That could kind of foreshadow a little bit what could happen here, to your point, Charlie, about kind of being able to get a retail through a micro.
Right. And, to piggyback on Charlie's point too, with the impact licensee, or if you're going for one of those hemp processor grower qualified licenses for the micro businesses or cultivation processing, if you are an impact licensee and you are not selected in that initial lottery, so we know impact lottery will happen before the other lotteries, your application will be moved into the general lottery. That's also explicit in the law. So certainly an advantage there too. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Gia. Application readiness, and we can move to the next. So general tips for a strong application. So we just talked a little bit about financing, right? Even though this isn't a merit-based application, it still isn't going to be cheap. You are going to have to pay an application fee for each lottery ball you're submitting. Those fees are not laid out in the law. That will be pushed into regulation. So, you'll know by February for sure, hopefully well before that. But you will be required to pay an application fee. Impact applicants will pay a reduced fee. But again, depending on how many balls you're able to submit, which will depend on your corporate structure, right? You'll need to plan to have the money for those application fees. And then it's putting together the application. And we're going to talk about this in a bit, but capitalization, there isn't something like a $250,000 per dispensary that you need to show, like we saw in places like Kentucky, for example. But it is something they're going to consider. And it is one of the few things they can explicitly deny your application for, is if you aren't able to show financial readiness to operate the business. So it's unclear whether or not they're going to require you to submit something. It's a possibility for sure, certainly not an impossibility. But just as far as planning for your business, 18 months is a very short time period after you get a lottery ball drawn to start, hire your team, to select your location, go through zoning, go through getting building permits, all of those things, and start operating, or at least thinking about operating and opening your business. That time flies for anyone that's ever actually opened one of these businesses and gone through the process of getting all the permits that are required, the security requirements. It's a lot. So 18 months doesn't seem like, it may sound like a long time, but it's not. And then you have the opportunity for 1 6-month extension beyond that. So you want to be very clear with these things when you're looking at investors. Impact licensees, I'm sure, will certainly be going to investors. Something that Charlie's going to talk about is Virginia is really going to scrutinize, it's clear from the bill, any sort of predatory relationship in these initial applications with impact licensees. They've made that very clear. They will deny the application. And then if you are issued a license and it does come to light that there's some sort of predatory relationship there with an impact licensee, that license will be revoked. And there's a number of fines that could be levied against you for that. You can move to the next slide, Kia. So application stage requirements, other things you need to be thinking about now, impact licensee determination. So if you think you qualify for an impact licensee, like Meg said, our director of economics, who does all of our market analysis, has already pulled data for at least one of the first criteria in that prong, that initial prong that says you have to have resided in one of these areas or one of these areas. You do not have to be a Virginia resident to be an impact licensee. That was actually explicitly struck out from the old law. It's US Census Bureau data. So we have the data for one of those criteria. We're still waiting on it for the other. I don't know when we'll see that information come out from the state. Hopefully it will be sooner rather than later, but we can certainly start looking at that and collecting that documentation now. Generally, to show that you've lived in one of those areas, you're looking at collecting tax returns, proof of lease, things like that, deed to the home, all that good stuff. So I'm sure they'll publish a long list of information. It will likely look the same as we've seen in other states. So we have a good idea of that. You should start collecting that now. proof of inspection or pending request for Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. This is for some of your farmer and hemp businesses that are allowed to apply. In addition to that, in order to be one of the qualified hemp grower or processors for those 100 impact licenses or 100 micro business licenses, you would have to show that you were actually registered as one of those businesses prior to 2021, which is kind of wild, and that you are in good standing as of 2026. Or if you no longer have the license, you were in good standing whenever you let that license expire or you surrendered it, whatever it may be. So that's kind of wild that it's a 2020 pre-2021 requirement there. Collecting that documentation might be difficult as well. We will see background checks for each license applicant, all of the regular personal disclosures we see for most states, payment of your application fees, and then submission of a labor peace agreement. This is kind of wild because it is explicitly in the law that at the initial application submission, every applicant will be required to submit a signed LPA. We certainly have contacts at most all of the larger unions. I'm sure the form agreements will look very similar to those we have seen in other states, but you will need to start contacting those groups, start working with them to get that agreement signed, and it is a requirement for your initial application submission. Go ahead to the next slide, Gia. So capitalization requirements, like I said, there's not express capitalization requirements here, but in order for you to be successful, right, it's really important to start thinking about these now. It goes back to your corporate structure as well. And if you can't show financial responsibility at initial application time and potentially moving through that 18-month period, there's a good chance that your license will not be issued, your application would be denied or revoked. So a very important piece of this is that. I know there's been some questions about the local jurisdictions. So while we've said real estate isn't required, it is not an impossibility that they will conduct these lotteries by region or require you to include a region. It is a possibility. The only explicit thing we know won't be required is that you have a property. But there is a lot of geographic distribution language in the bill, so it is certainly possible that they would conduct these lotteries by region or require you to include a region. We won't know yet until we move to regulation or we see application guidance. You can move to the next slide. Oh, and this is actually Charlie to talk to you a little bit more about the corporate side of things.
All right, so big picture with the corporate side of things, we don't have the complete picture yet. Obviously, we now have the definitive bill, which gives us a much clearer picture. I mean, I could be more definitive here than I was in the last iteration of this webinar. We still don't have the rules. And the rules are going to color in some key open areas here. The board does still have a lot of discretion, and this will be done through the rulemaking process. So you kind of still have to take this with a grain of salt. It's not totally set in stone, right? So, I mean, in terms of like what I'm waiting for is for my job, the big thing is the rules. Obviously the application itself, the FAQs and the guidance is critical from a licensing perspective. From the corporate perspective, you got to look very carefully at the rules because a lot of this stuff lives in this, a lot of these deals live in this gray area. Particularly if you're talking about something, like we're just talking about impact licensing and what constitutes predatory. It's not always clear what this means. So, I mean, and then the final stage, I always talk about is like there's the statute, there are the rules, and then there's the regulator practice, which is a key element here in terms of how this stuff works. And obviously, how this plays out in practice. Like, I give the example of New York. If you just read the statute and you just read the rules in New York, it would not explain the way the market operates in New York State. You have to look at the degree or non-degree of regulatory enforcement to see how to explain the markets. In any event, what I'm trying to say here is that like we can't, I don't have definitive answers right now in a lot of these cases. But next slide, please. But we'll learn more as we go. So this is just these considerations really would apply for any state, right? So is written pre-approval required prior to closing? So before I even jump into that, it's worth talking about, whether you'll be able to, if you suppose you win a license in a prime location, right? One of the things is like, can I flip it, right? Um, for a quick immediate profit. So first off, the impact licensees is it's very clear you can't transfer for 5 years. So they've kind of taken that concept from Maryland. So that obviously will suppress the value of those licenses because they can't be freely transferred, so they're less liquid. I'm sure people will try and do those deals through convoluted deal structures, but I suspect the regulators will kind of try and stop those from happening, and those may be difficult deals for people to structure and close on. Other question, looking at other states is, you do need written pre-approval to close a M&A transaction very clearly in the statute in Virginia. So it's not clear at what stage of licensure that opportunity for approval will be granted, right? So if you sort of win if you win the lottery, I think it'd be unlikely for them to allow you to sell that to a third party, right? But before you get to a point where it's built out at all, if you got to a later stage of approval. And this is something that will get fleshed out in both the rulemaking and then sort of the FAQ and guidance stage of the thing. So don't, I wouldn't count on having the ability to sort of like win a lottery ticket and then sell it immediately. You may be able to come to some sort of deal with investors, but usually in these states they won't let you transfer control. Are local license approvals required in addition to state approval? So this is another thing where here, there's not going to be any local licenses to worry about, like Massachusetts or California. Are workarounds regulated, very clearly regulated in the statute, but the details of how the regulations work will be fleshed out in rules. How difficult is it to move a license? I don't think we can answer this question yet, but this matters a lot in M&A transactions because, if you're able to transfer, if you're able to do an asset deal, you may be able to get out of a bad lease. I've and there's nothing in the statute that would prohibit you from doing an asset deal, but we'll have to see how this plays out in regulations. This matters because I've seen in certain states, um, I've seen in certain states. I just saw a comment pointing out that these managed service agreements are popping up in Minnesota. So like Virginia explicitly discusses MSAs in the statute. So you can call it something else, but it would require approval in Virginia. So yeah, moving a license can matter because you might be in a bad lease and someone might be interested in a license if they can move it to a better lease. And then yeah, like I point out, the last thing, what are other people in the market doing? For instance, like I always point to New York. So New York is a state where there is no current path to close an M&A transaction. However, I don't know how many, but a lot of M&A transactions have been inked in New York. None of them have closed yet, really, because there is no way. The OCM has not produced a process yet to approve an M&A transaction. Next slide. Yeah, equity. So this is the other big sort of suite of considerations. It's like, to me, it's like the three-part question, right? There's M&A, there's equity financings, and there's debt financings. So equity is almost always regulated much more rigorously than debt in cannabis. So you got to look at the materiality level for approval. The extremes here are some states like Massachusetts is 20% now for materiality. Other states, historically have had no materiality level, meaning that even adding like a small shareholder requires approval, which makes it difficult to raise money. Will they allow you to have veto rights and control? If you had a board member, does that require pre-approval? Are your investors comfortable with the background check, and what does that background check look like? So this is the number one thing, not necessarily the number one thing, but one of the top things I always discuss with people doing a raise and talking to their investors is you want to make sure whoever's on your cap table understands what's coming in terms of a background check and they're okay with it, because what is, consistently a disaster is adding someone to your cap table and then a background check comes around and the investor's like, I don't want to fill this out. And the regulator says, I don't care. This is the rule. You got to fill it out. Now you're caught in a very difficult position to be in, right? So, you want to get ahead of that and talk to through the investors. And then, yeah, can you do a rolling close as a possibility? And the good news is, to just preview this, I think Virginia has a pretty workable set of rules to raise equity capital. The challenge, of course, for everyone is going to be that, private capital in the cannabis industry, public capital too, very limited right now. It's a difficult environment to raise capital unless like you're a hot AI startup, in which case, it must be nice. But for the rest of us, it's tough out there. So, the having the regulatory stuff buttoned up is going to make it easier for you. But obviously, that's just one of the challenges you're going to face. Obviously, the sort of poor performance of a number of cannabis companies that have been very public facing has made the soured the general public on the investment opportunity. Though I think Virginia is going to be a very good market because it's limited license. It's a big state, both geographically and in terms of population and in terms of wealth. And the states where things really haven't worked is where you have way too many licenses chasing too few dollars. Next slide, please. Debt. So debt up between M&A and equity. Yeah, debt is your distant third place in terms of how it's regulated. These are the questions you should ask yourself. We can't answer all of these in Virginia right now because of the fact we don't have the rules yet. But these are the big ones you got to think about. Next slide. Yeah, these are just sort of my general piece of advice for people raising capital is like just get ahead of the investor regulatory questions. Think about the structure. So what do I mean by don't reinvent the wheel? I've seen this in cannabis a lot. People come up with these really funky ways of raising money. It's like we're going to pay you based on this thing or that thing. It's like to me, it's like just take, you can just take whatever is a standard way of raising money. It could be a safe, a convertible note, it could be a Series A. Just stick to something that's not too crazy. Securities law, don't forget securities law applies. You want to protect yourself. I'm not a big PPM guy, a private placement memorandum, these long documents that people use when they're raising capital, primarily because I just think it's sort of like excessive for a private capital raise. But we do strongly encourage using risk factors in raising capital. It's one of these things where it's like they can be scary to read, but if things go south, you'll be glad you had investors sort of acknowledge they read it. It's a lot of legal stuff is meant to sort of protect you in the event of a downside scenario. Be careful with investors without previous cannabis industry experience. I've seen sometimes people just have unrealistic expectations. Yeah, and then yeah, be careful of scammers. If something's too good to be true in cannabis, it's too good to be true. Though I would just, as a side note, say if anyone has pitched you on an ESOP, employee stock ownership plan, that can sound too good to be true, but that is very real. ESOPs have been part of the tax code for over 40 years. It's very real, but if someone's offering you interest, your startup company, 8% interest, I just need $15,000 up front to run the diligence. That's a scam for sure. Next slide. Yeah, so get into the details in projects. Next slide. Yeah, ownership is broadly defined, 10% equity voting or economic. I think it's probably, it's whatever picks you up, like read it broadly for sure. Traces through entities, goes to the ultimate beneficial owners. There's no exception for public companies, but with a 10% threshold, that shouldn't really matter. Usually this means like directors, officers, or managers up the chain of the 10% owners kind of get pulled into the system, but 10% is workable, right? Because most startups, right? Like you're not going to have a ton of 10 plus equity share, and you can always keep people below that threshold if they won't go through a background check. Next slide. Vertical integration is allowed, subject to caps, 5 total licenses per person, excluding transporters. Micro is totally siloed, as is testing facilities. That's very common. Next slide. Yeah, so change of control. What's new here is it says 25% cumulative transfers over 24 months. I haven't seen that in other states. That's a new concept. Um, Also, change of control includes manager appointment or approval rights. We'll see further details in rules here, but you know, you need pre-approval close an M&A deal basically is the long short of it in Virginia. Next slide. Yeah, so interesting. Someone pointed out in the chat, and we'll take your questions here in a second. I'm just kind of cranking through the rest of this. Yeah, management agreement requires CCA approval. So, you could do it without approval, but I would strongly advise against that. That's clearly a violation of the rule. Other concept here that's interesting, and this may be only interesting to me and a few other people that care about the overlap between alcohol and cannabis law, but they borrowed this undue influence concept from the three-tier alcohol system, which is basically in the alcohol world, they're very worried about producers controlling, uh, both retailers and, retailers meaning on premise and off premise, so like liquor stores and bars. Because there was pre-prohibition, there was a huge issue with bars turning into dens of iniquity or whatever. So they were worried about this stuff. So you can't control the retail tier unless you're in the now you can. It's interesting here though. You can be vertically integrated in a way you couldn't be in alcohol, but if you don't own the license, you can't exercise undue influence. So yeah, brand licensing, financing, and management agreements all require pre-approval. The details we'll see in the regs. Next slide. Other interesting things in Virginia, the board's going to decide market share limits, and they're going to use sort of federal antitrust concepts to avoid concentration, and they can turn down transactions if this gets overturned. So, we've seen a lot of questions about like, well, what's it going to look like regionally in terms of license awards? So they do have this authority, the board, to sort of determine like regional breakdown, but nothing's in the statute. Next. Yeah, impact license constraints. Yeah, it says control, 51% ownership and control must remain with the qualifying individual. So that the challenge here with striking these deals is finding a way from a business perspective, the investors can get comfortable, but still not impinging on the regulatory required control of the individual. These are very difficult deals to structure and close. But yeah, and you can lose your license. Federal policy changes will go real quick here, just so everyone knows. We got this hemp ban incoming. I don't think we talked about it here, but part of these rules, hemp regulation transfers from VDAX to CCA, and the 25 to 1 exception, meaning that you can go up over the milligram cap if there's a 25 to 1 ratio of CBD to THC, it goes away. So that combined with the incoming federal hemp ban should change the market. If you're not aware of that. And then, yeah, so the adult use Schedule 1 administrative hearing is currently ongoing. So, regardedly optimistic we hear back by Q4 in a positive manner on that, but that's another kind of open point, just so everyone's aware. It's kind of not the subject here, but it's worth mentioning. Next slide. Yeah, so want everyone to sign up for our newsletter because if we don't want you going off up to old information, and there's definitely going to be new information coming out here. Also, yeah, if you're at Lucky Leaf, please stop by our booth. This is end of August. And then, yeah, we're thinking October 8th for another Richmond happy hour. So definitely consider coming to that, signing up for that. And yeah, let's see if we got any questions we can handle here. Will there be a set number of licenses for each zone? Meg?
There's nothing in the law so far that suggests that that is how there will be rolled out. Although, as mentioned, there is a goal to kind of ensure that licenses are evenly distributed. Certainly, we've seen in the medical program that, we had different health service areas. Um, you know, a lot of times kind of past behavior is a good indicator of future behavior. So we may see the CCA kind of adopt a health service area model like they've done in their own medical program, or like we've seen in Maryland. But we just don't know yet.
Yeah, and that's again, that's why we want you to like make sure you're getting these updates because the fact that we don't know, that's true now, but it's not going to be true, going into the application process. Um, let's see here. What option do mom and pop cottage people in the gray industry have for obtaining a license? So I don't think anything in the statute would preclude you as a participant in the gray market from applying for a license in this current phase, but you certainly don't have any kind of leg up. The only people that are given sort of like an advantage here are the hemp people and the other impact licensees. So, essentially you can apply alongside everyone else.
Charlie, we've had a number of questions about
Please.
timeline. So I just wanted to be clear on timeline. February, they're not issuing licenses. February 1st is the date by which we see regulations promulgated. They have a deadline for that. And applications will open up for micro businesses and pharmaceutical processors. And then it's not until, I believe, May that we see the first batch of issuance. That's the requirement of 100 micro businesses, 10 cultivation, 10 processing to the hemp qualified, and approving pharmaceutical processors. Then July 1, they're required to issue at least 55 additional licenses, doesn't specify license type, between impact licensees and general applicants. So those are our deadlines for license issuance, with type only being the hemp cultivation processing and the micro businesses.
Okay. And I guess, yeah, well, listen, if we didn't address your question, feel free to hire us and pay us a lot of money to answer your question privately. Or yeah, I'm just kidding. Just shoot us a question. If it's easy, we can answer it off the cuff. And
Go ahead, Charlie.
I was just gonna say, I was just wrapping it up. So if there's anything else you want to say, I mean, reach out to us, stay on our newsletter thing, hopefully meet us in Richmond, either in August or October. We'll be, I don't know if we're gonna be able to make the event in this month, but otherwise I should be at all the if it's within a 2 or 3 hour drive of DC, I should be at all the Virginia events. Um, but
Yeah,
yeah,
thank you
Jerrico,
all.
Megan.
I was just going to say thank you all so much for your time. Obviously, this is kind of a evolving landscape, but it's wonderful to have more things nailed down than we did at any other point this year. And as we continue to kind of dot the i's, cross the t's, get more information, we'll continue to kind of roll out information. So look forward very much to staying in touch. Jerrico?
Yeah, thanks everyone. Feel free to shoot us an email with your questions. Happy to do a consult with everyone and look forward to hopefully working with some of you as we roll out Virginia starting July 2027. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.